coming today to our roundtable on women in conflict. My name is Renee DeNevers. I'm a professor in the Department of Public Administration and International Affairs. And my sole purpose today, other than inviting you all here, is to introduce our chair, because we were able to find Matt Evangelista, who drove up from Cornell University, where he is a professor in the political science department, who has done research on a variety of different topics, including the question of women and conflict. So I asked him if he would be able to take over and lead our discussion with the panelists that we have here today. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to him, and we will have discussion and then open to the audience for participation as well. Okay? So take it away, Matt.
Thanks very much, Renee, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to join such a distinguished panel. I won't hide from you that I haven't met any of its members before. In fact, it was one of the main attractions to coming up here, so that I could meet them and hear what they have to say. Our topic of women in conflict, or perhaps gender in conflict, is a better way of thinking about the issue, is certainly timely. We've seen a couple of news items just in the last couple of weeks. The infamous photo of President Obama with his cabinet, which didn't have any women in it. It created quite a scandal. He wanted, as you well know, to have a woman as Secretary of State again to replace the incumbent. That failed. It was not his fault. Many political scientists who have studied this issue actually don't see much difference in terms of a state's foreign and military policy, its propensity to go to war, connected to whether women are in leadership positions. It may seem counterintuitive, although it does fit our anecdotal evidence when we think of prominent women leaders like Indira Gandhi or Golda Meir or Margaret Thatcher. We don't think of them as any pursuing policies much different from their male counterparts. Social scientists would say that by the time they reach that high a level, they've become socialized into certain norms that they then share with their male colleagues. There's quite interesting research, though, that suggests other factors regarding gender, and especially gender equality, do affect foreign policy. For example, the proportion of women in higher education, or who have received higher education, the proportion of women in parliament. And the argument there is that the greater the gender equality, the greater the proportion of women, the less bellicose a state's foreign policy. This is a particular finding, two independent studies, one by Eric Melander of Oslo and one by Mary Caprioli here in the United States. It's an area for those looking for research projects that I think is quite promising. What difference does gender make? The second issue, obviously, that's been in the news just the past couple of days is the decision by the U.S. Department of Defense to open all positions in combat to women service members, with certain criteria, physical tests that would be applied across the board to both men and women. This is an area that hasn't been very well explored in terms of its impact, because this is probably the most significant experiment of its kind in the United States. Israel certainly has large numbers of women involved in its military forces, but I remember some years ago we invited an Israeli general who was the general in charge of training the tank forces, and she described how she didn't always get the respect she thought she should, because she had never directed combat operations, tank operations, even though she was quite expert at training, and therefore among her male subordinates, she wasn't always fully respected. That situation for the United States presumably can change now, and we know that there are a lot of other implications for post-conflict health benefits when women are recognized not only as having been in combat, but having been in combat as part of their legitimate jobs. Today we're not focusing so much on on the United States. Our experts here have worked all over the world, and they've looked at the role of gender and women in conflict and in post-conflict situations. So that's more our focus today. Professor de Nevers has asked us to highlight a few questions, and so our format will be for each speaker to take up to 10 minutes to address these questions to the extent that they are able in the context of their own research and in their own experience, because we have both academics and practitioners and people who share elements of from both worlds here. I think that's one of the real benefits of our panel and also of your school, of course. So the questions that were posed to the panelists were, why should we care about the focus of women in conflict situations? What is unique about their experience of war and conflict? How does war change women's role and place in society? Again, this will have implications for the United States, but my suspicion is that most of the discussion will not be about the United States. And finally, what can women contribute to resolving conflicts, rebuilding states and communities? And again, our experts have considerable background in this area. As I tell my students, I'm teaching a first-year writing course this semester. I'm, like the rest of us, in this transition between paper and paperless. So with full confidence, I thought I could go paperless, and then, in fact, I had to borrow Carol's paper in order to find those questions again. Let me introduce all the panelists, and then we'll hear what they have to say. We're going in alphabetical order because that's how I have their biographies, and we're starting with Professor Catherine Bertini, who's here at my immediate right. She's a professor of public administration and international affairs with long experience in the public sector, working for international organizations, and in the private sector and in the U.S. government. I'll highlight just a couple of elements of her biography. She was a longtime director of the United Nations World Food Program, the executive director, and worked in famine relief in some of the cases that are best known to us, the famine in North Korea, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. She worked during the crises. Her organization worked in Bosnia and Kosovo, which is also an area that other speakers will be discussing. Within the U.S. government, she served as Assistant Secretary of Food and Consumer Services at the U.S. Department of Agriculture and continues to serve as a member of the Board of International Food and Agricultural Development. Here at Syracuse, she teaches courses in humanitarian action, UN management, girls' education, international organizations, executive leadership, and post-conflict reconstruction. So you can see several areas that are relevant to our topic today. Then we'll have Azra Hamadic, who is a cultural...
Well done.
I don't know how long I rehearsed
you'll
that
have
one.
to do today.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. No, you're right. It's going to be all downhill from here. She's a cultural anthropologist who works on anthropology of international policy in the context of peace building and state making in post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina. The issue here, that as many of us will remember, actually, I'm looking at the ages, as some of us will remember,
You and I may remember.
an extremely brutal conflict that saw the breakup of Yugoslavia with much of the violence gender-oriented mass campaigns of rape, but paradoxically, in the settlement that ended the war, women were very little involved in the post-conflict reconstruction efforts, and I'm guessing that Azra might have something to say about that. I don't insist, but then we have Isaac Kafir, who is teaching international relations and law here at Syracuse, in particular international human rights law, post-conflict reconstruction, the rule of law, and international security. He's been a senior researcher at the International Institute of Counterterrorism in Herzliya, Israel, where you probably know Dima Adamski, who's someone I admire a great deal. Then we'll have Abby Stock, who, I'm sorry, Abby Steele. It says so right here, but if I make it a little bit bigger, I'll actually sorry. She teaches here in the Maxwell School in Public Policy and International Affairs. Her research interests include civil wars, violence, and state building. She's recently come from a postdoctoral position at Princeton University. Finally, Professor Cora True-Frost, whom I misnamed a little bit earlier, sorry about that, who holds an LLM from Harvard Law School and teaches international law at the Maxwell School. She's worked in East Timor and Sierra Leone with the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security at the headquarters of the United Nations. So an extremely accomplished and well-qualified panel to talk about the issues on the agenda for today. And I'd like to invite Professor Bertini to start, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Matt, for coming and leading us today, and thank you also, Renee, Professor Ginevers, for organizing this panel. I brought some, Secretary Panetta's announcement yesterday prompted me to go to a little museum in Cortland, New York, where I live, and pick up some pieces from my exhibition there, where I collect and show women at work that I've collected from around the world. And so I was really prompted, although we're not only going to discuss women actually in armed conflict themselves, to bring my women warriors to join us today. So they are here from Burkina Faso, Thailand, Israel, Angola, Joan of Arc, a pirate, and a buffalo soldier from the U.S. As kind of depictions from around the world of women fighting. But those are the people who are easy to characterize, figurines that are easy to collect. The people that are kind of nameless and faceless are the millions of women around the world, and particularly the vast majority in any particular conflict, who are not the warriors, but yet the victims, really, of the war that the men around them are waging. And it is they and their children who are the people on whom I've mostly focused in my work at the World Food Program and in other roles, because they are the ones that are so often cut off from the whole rest of their normal lives. But at the same time, women are the ones that are holding their families together and holding the communities together. The women are the ones not at war or not away seeking work to send money home, but rather the ones that are trying to keep everything collected and together and their children safe. That means that when we think, as I do, from the perspective of how we support women living in the midst of war, or in fact women living in post-conflict reconstruction, that we actually have to pay attention to who they are. So often in the development world and in the humanitarian world, we talk about numbers of people who are at risk because of the war. And we even talk about the kind of shelter they might need or the kind of food they might need. But we don't pay enough attention to who they are. And we don't listen enough to them as we're putting together whatever kinds of programs we're going to do in order to try to help them. And by not listening to them, we often do the wrong things. That means we send the wrong implements that are not the implements that the women who are the farmers in most situations are going to be using to go back to the farming after a conflict. We're not listening to them about food that's easier to cook than other kinds of food that may take longer to cook, because we're not paying attention to the people who actually have to find the water and the firewood and actually do the cooking themselves. We're not paying attention and talking to the people who are actually having to hold their families together amid some sort of temporary housing that we are providing. Since women are so seldom in leadership roles, they're not the ones that are NGOs, that our international organizations, that our bilateral aid agencies are necessarily talking to when they go to try to see how can we help. And so it is that on which I want to highlight that our work needs to, that we need to pay more attention in our work. Because we do kind of just see people out there and not see who and why and what they need. We are not always as helpful as we could be. in that context, of course, if we're going to set up systems where we might be able to listen to women, then we're creating some sort of, in some cases, some sort of informal network to hear women's voices, and therefore have women in leadership roles, even if those leadership roles are just on the basis of communicating with the people bringing aid. But those leadership roles are critical, again, in order to help rebuild the communities, because they are the women who are going to be not only there during the fighting, but also there afterwards to try to rebuild. And if we are able to build some informal networks, even between them and aid agencies, between them and development organizations, we will be able to, we from the outside will be able to contribute more than we would just by virtue of supporting in some way or another with some physical assistance. We had several examples of working this way at the World Food Program, for instance, listening to the voices of women in Afghanistan during the Taliban, and then helping to raise those voices to leadership to say women are going to starve at home unless, widows especially, because you won't let them go out outside without a male, unless we have set up systems where there are bakeries run by women and you allow the widows to go in order to go to those places. That made a huge difference, saved a lot of lives. We did it in southern Sudan where, because of the constant fighting between the north and the south, there couldn't be real services provided, so World Food Program would fly in food and dump it out of the back of an airplane. But then who's going to have the food? So we convinced the chiefs in the villages that there should be committees that were with at least a majority women on each committee, because they were the ones who would know most about what the needs were of the people there. So those programs then, even if the programs didn't exist, the women had the experience of being in more leadership role and being able to be more involved in the future. Just two more thoughts on this point before I give the floor back to Matt. That the humanitarian programs of the UN now are considering this more formally, and they now have, in fact, guidelines on gender, where they're asking every group of organizations, whether they're working in clusters on water, on sanitation, on food, on shelter, to think about a whole range of issues relating to gender, and specifically who is being served, what their needs are, what their aspirations are for the future. This is a really important step in the right direction. And so my second point is that if you find yourself analyzing a real life situation after you get your degrees and you're working in these areas, my main message is to remember to pay attention to who are the people who we're trying to serve in any situation, but especially in a war or post-war situation, because if we find the person who is actually holding the family together, that's going to be the woman, and she needs to have her voice heard.
Thanks very much. A model in terms of the issues that we're trying to address, and not least the amount of time that it took to address them. Thanks so much. And also raising important issues that I think we'll want to follow up on. The really important element of local participation by women, and who are they, but possibly in tension with what the local traditions and political practices are. If the local society doesn't typically allow women to have a voice, I imagine that's quite a practical issue on the ground for humanitarian aid organizations. I'm going to turn it over to Azra now, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you. And I think I'll, from a probably different point of view, come to some of the things that you mentioned already. And I would like to begin by thanking Renee as well to bring us together, and I hope it's not the last time. My interest in gender, I never considered myself really a gender person, but my first publication was about it, and I think we're all genders, interested in gender in some way or another, right? Inevitably it comes up in whatever you research, it's going to be a dimension of what you're looking at in the social world. So you cannot not do gender, really. But only a few people call themselves gender experts. My own interest in gender-related issues is motivated by two interrelated factors. Growing up during the Bosnian War, I was 16 when the war that was mentioned began, and I lived through the war, and then I came to the United States. So I witnessed some of the things that are the subject of the talk today. And then I looked at scholarly writings about this, and I was deeply puzzled, confused, somewhat betrayed by what I was reading. So my first publication was an answer to this, and the main, most of the research and that was coming out of the Bosnian War that looked at rape as a war crime, and this Bosnian case was the one that basically signaled a change in the way that international law looks at rape, right? So it was a very important moment internationally, was that there were, most of these discussions revolved around three issues. Women as ethnic subjects and ethnic properties, women as women, meaning as gendered subjects, and then women as subjects of trauma, right? Primarily caught in this script of PTSD. And I felt that all of these discourses, even though they assembled into a very telling account, were missing the voice, right? How was this really lived in everyday life, right? And not only because voices were absent, sometimes women were talking about this. Women from Bosnia came out, even though no one believed they would because of the honor and shame and everything that accompanies these accounts, but many women spoke out. However, what do we do with a voice that's frozen? The words that are spoken, but you can tell they're frozen. The grammar of language and life as it existed disappears. What do you do with that kind of voice, right? That articulates words, but you see they're sliding off. They're not capturing what it's really like. So then we have to look at silence, at what's missing, what's not being told, and what do we do with silence as researchers, as policymakers, right? Silences are telling as well, right? Where to look for silence, how to unpack it, right? That has to be, because we're talking not about only voices being frozen. We're talking about life as we know it falling apart to the point that you existentially don't even know who you are or who the people you thought were the ones who loved you unconditionally are, right? In these kinds of existential times of crisis, what happens is that women on the level of every day usually fall these extreme forms of violence into post-war. By rebuilding through habitual behavior, through everyday relationships, they're repairing the social fabric. Oftentimes very quietly, right? It's done through these processes of trying to rebuild a relationship with your sister-in-law. It might take a year or two, but it's women who oftentimes carry these silent works of repair. And I think this also echoes something you said. So why do we have to pay attention to women in conflict? Because we have to pay attention to women in peace. Peace and conflict are not separated. In the peacetime, women are also subject of extreme forms of violence. So we cannot look at extreme forms of violence in separation from everyday so-called symbolic or structural violences. If you're going to look, because if you look at everyday peace situation, you're also going to see that women are subject to these violences. Why in the war this becomes more visible? Because the situation is so extreme. So then we visibly see how heterosexual and heteronormative matrices that are putting women in the position of inferiority in peace are becoming highlighted. Why? Because women become territories, the bodies over which battles are being won, over which messages are being exchanged. So in the war, so how women are changed by the war, they change oftentimes from women into ethnic women. So we don't talk necessarily about women per se, we talk about Albanian or Afghani or these kinds of women. And this is also, this kind of labeling has its own effects. It's to some extent also homogenizing the experience of suffering. Okay. So women's bodies literally become messages through which exchanges are sent, like signs that are symbols, right? So rape of a high number of women is sending certain kind of messages to the enemy man. You're failing to protect the honor, you're failing to protect your women. And then what ends up, women are being caught into these discourses of women and children, right, who need to be protected, right? And this is also in many ways disempowering. Thus we have that notion of women and children as one word almost. It's kind of now being thrown out there. It's circulating as one thing. Okay. So women become less of women, more of Muslim women, American women, or whatnot. And what I want to say is, in terms of reconciliation, this is going to be the final thing I'm going to talk about. In terms of reconciliation, there is a very interesting thing that the policy does that troubles me, and I saw this in the Bosnian conflict, but beyond that one as well. Oftentimes, there's an assumption that women are naturally more gifted to build peace, right? This is, again, this is, again, thinking about the world and women in a bad script, right? Because it's naturalizing this tendency of women to be, because they're mothers and they care and they lost their sons, so they'll come together, right? Well, this is very disempowering because oftentimes there are NGOs, international NGOs, that go to these places with money and in resources with these kinds of missions, right? So this oftentimes is marginalizing women because these kinds of things are oftentimes not at the center of political debate. Thus, they're absent. At the same time, in many places in which politics is considered dirty and corrupt, this marginalized space can also be a space of empowering. And I saw Bosnian women really flipping this in a very interesting way because politics is understood as dirty and as a whore, literally, that's the term. Politics is a whore. Even if you're a fine individual, you're going to be corrupt by it. Since they're seen as marginalized, the ones who do reconciliation, they can actually come from that position and shape public opinion because they're not political, thus they're moral, thus they're not dirty, right? So it can be, while it can have a negative effect, it also can provide space for agency. So I think I'm just going, because I have so much to say, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate that you're raising issues connected to your particular case and area of research, but with real general applicability, especially the issue of violence during peacetime, the connection between violence and war and domestic violence, which I know is still a controversial issue in the case of Serbia. Did domestic violence, including sexual violence, go up during the wars or not? And the issue that if we think of women as peaceful, that is disempowering in a way. It also allows men to feel free to be violent because somebody has to do it in the defense of the nation or something like that. So again, really important issues that have a lot wider applicability. I'd like to turn to Isaac now, please.
Well, again, thank you, Renee, for organizing this, and thank you, Matt, for sharing. I'm going to try and piggyback on what Catherine and Azra said. My sort of interest in women in conflict started really from peace studies, and one of the challenges that we face is, of course, to define conflict, especially in the post-Cold War period. What exactly is conflict? And one of the challenges that peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers, often face is when does the conflict end? And again, what kind of measures should be taken to address the challenges of the contemporary society? Domestic violence was often an issue that peacekeepers had to address, and of course sexual violence that peacekeepers were committing, which the UN slowly, after I think 2006, began to properly address. But in the post-Cold War period, 90% of the casualties are civilians, and the majority of which are women. So this is sort of why we need to start to really address this. But my kind of interest really started by thinking about contextualizing and the texts that were being used when we were looking at women. So if we look throughout history, and I was a history major, when we look at women in history, they're either portrayed as the virgin queens or as the seductress or the whores. And if you read books like Pashtun Tales or books from English literature, that's kind of the portrayal that you see the women. And very often that portrayal has remained is how we see women in the 21st century. That contextualization, we see the women in the camps, the women who are being victimized, but without really understanding the structural violence that breeds into that kind of culture. And if you look into situations, whether it is in South Africa after the apartheid regime, domestic violence skyrocketed. And some of the studies seem to suggest that it was largely because the African men were not explained how to address and deal with women, and because especially they saw the apartheid state beating women. So that was a form of indoctrination. So my work really sort of deals with how do we contextualize, how do we move on in terms of how we address the structural violence that exists in some of these societies. And again, as a lawyer, I'm very interested in the progressive interpretation of the law. you know, the law is very slow when it comes to addressing violence towards women. I mean, we heard about the ICTY. The fact that in the Tadic case, consent was an issue when it came to rape is unacceptable. Whereas in the Akiaso case, thanks to Justice Pillay, it wasn't even a factor. So one of the things that I think as scholars, as lawyers, as political scientists, we have to address is how are we going to change the rule of law to address that public-private divide as well that seems to permit those kind of tension. And again, I urge you all to read the works of Hilary Charlesworth and Christine Chinkin, who've done wonderful work on identifying the genderized nature of international law. Who drafts the law? Well, it's predominantly men. Who enforces the law? And again, it's predominantly men. Professor Bertini mentioned the lack of women in peace negotiation. Well, the commission that led to the responsibility to protect, there was one woman on that commission out of 11 other men. At the Secretary General High Panel report, there were 4 women and 12 men. At the ICTY, 6% of the judges are women. And that's unacceptable. Now, so it then leads us to a question: is do more women bring us better justice in terms of gender violence and sexual violence? And we can certainly have that discussions because the studies are very contradictory on that element. So to me, the reason why we need to address women in conflict, because that allows us to address structural problems within our society that permits discrimination to continue. And I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Renee knows why, but I'm still undergoing some kind of cultural shock here. I just spent the last semester in Rome, and to hear people here who know so much and who can be so concise and fit within our time limits, it's just, excuse the cultural stereotype, but I haven't experienced that in the last 4 months, so thank you so much. So, Abby, please.
Okay. Well, I spend a lot of time doing my fieldwork in Colombia, so I hope that I don't violate you already. I've been deeply influenced by my Colombian friends. But so again, thank you, Renee, for organizing the panel, and Matt for coming up for it. So I'll try to stick to the questions that were posed because it helps me organize a bit. So I guess why, not that you didn't, but I just have to repeat it to myself. So why should we care? I think all of the previous speakers have already identified why, other than the fact that women are half of any population should already mean that we should care about what happens with women in these wars, and how I think wars are gendered is a somewhat separate question that we can think about differently. I'll talk more about sort of women's experiences as both protagonists and victims within civil wars. They have a diversity of experiences, obviously. And I think as protagonists, you see women operating as informants, transporters of weapons, and then combatants in some cases. And I think in the Colombian case, for example, there are many FARC combatants, and it's very linked to the ideology of the organization. Although we know also that there are still very heavily gendered roles. So a brief anecdote: friends of mine were kidnapped in Colombia, and while they were a couple, a man and woman, and they spent time with a small squadron of FARC combatants who were almost half and half, women and men. And my friend's partner, the man, would do their laundry, meaning he would take it down to the river and sort of wash it against the rocks with the female combatants. And the female combatants were just astounded. Asking my other friend, Anna, how can you get your partner to do the laundry? This is incredible. How does it work? So there's still, we do have, we think, some sense that women, for example, there are no women represented in the high command of the FARC. There's one Dutch woman now participating who is a FARC combatant who is participating in the peace talks, but she's quite the exception, and we don't know how much she's there because she's popular and beautiful, rather than she actually is influencing the course of the talks. But we also, of course, have women as victims. We've had lots of examples mentioned already. My work is on displacement, which specifically affects women quite differently than men. So a lot of the lethal deaths still remain men, especially among combatants. Women who are displaced, we know that they tend to head households much more than families that are not displaced. So in Colombia, about 60% of households are headed by women, and this really puts a huge burden on them, having to provide for their children. I'm sure, as Professor Bertini has a lot of experience with gathering the food and making those provisions. I think that's quite difficult. Sexual violence is a problem, although I would stress that there's a lot of variation in sexual violence, and I think this area is really important for future research. So, as in Bosnia, where it seemed to be quite systematic, quite symbolic, we have very low levels of sexual violence in a place like Colombia. But we don't have a good understanding of why. Why, in some cases, do armed groups use sexual violence, and in other cases, no.
I have an idea.
So work has been done on it. There's a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard, Dara K. Cohen, who argues that it relates to sort of the socialization within an armed group and how that helps them create bonds among one another if they don't have them already. So there are some arguments, but it's really hard to get good, solid evidence of who are sexual victims for lots of reasons. There's incentives to commit fraud, and there are obviously often stronger incentives not to disclose that you were a victim. So we don't even have good information, similar to domestic violence and lots of gendered violence. But so lots of work needs to be done. In terms of how war changes women's roles in society, especially with relation to displacement, one thing I already mentioned is that women become the sort of breadwinners and shoulder a lot of the responsibility for carrying on with their families. But in some cases, displaced households remain a unit, and this can also create problems. In Colombia, for example, women who are displaced resettle, and families who are displaced tend to resettle in more urban areas from rural places. And women's skills are more suited to the urban environment than men. So women can find work as housekeepers, they can find work selling small commodities on the street, they can find work, just doing laundry for other households, whereas men who've only experienced a rural experience in farming or agriculture or manual labor have a much harder time finding employment. So this creates, we think, some problems within the family that lead to things like domestic violence. So it does change women's roles in the family, and sometimes in a sort of negative way. And then finally, what can women contribute to resolving and sort of rebuilding communities? I think we can think about it at kind of two different levels. One would be at these sort of high-level talks, peace negotiations, and I guess I would say sort of these high-level talks where we know that women don't have a very strong role at all. It's unclear whether or not, in the case of Colombia, for example, how that would change the dynamic of the peace talks. Of course, peace talks are quite delicate anyway, and trying to incorporate everyone's perspective isn't always the best way to reach an agreement that is sustainable, but it's still worth raising that women's voices are not present in those talks. At the more community local level, which is something that I tend to study more, I think I agree with what has already been said, that women do participate in sort of informal ways to rebuild communities and to influence outcomes. But there's another way that the sort of interaction between international actors and trying to do peace reconstruction, oftentimes international actors impose rules about gender representation and gender decision making within formal structures. So in Afghanistan, there's been some work done by political scientists at MIT, Fotini Cristia, about the impact of including women's representations within the community councils that decide what to do with aid that's received and how that relates to gender roles more broadly. They find that there's really no effect on, at least short-term perspectives on gender roles changing, but that women do have an actual impact in terms of deciding how to distribute aid in a different way than would otherwise be the case if only men were represented on the councils. So oftentimes, I think that's another interesting area of study. So how how do sort of international Western norms influence very local level dynamics because of these requirements. In Colombia, the new land restitution law and land formalization law requires that a woman's name be on the title if there is a woman in the household. And I was talking with farmers one day, and the guy's saying, it says that I have to put my wife's name, you know, and the representative of the state was saying, yes, sir, you have to include your wife, but what if I don't want her on the title? It was really puzzling to him, and she just sat there shaking her head. So I think, you know, there are formal and informal ways that women, that sort of, in the more formal dimension, a lot of times it's sort of outside actors imposing some kind of rule that people need to abide by. And I think we don't really know if that has long-term effects for good or ill within these communities. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Again, raising questions in a comparative dimension that we'll want to discuss further, and some controversial issues about whether best practices work for the local communities and what kind of conflicts they may engender in that respect. So now we hear from Cora True-Frost.
Thank you, and thank you, Renee, for organizing the panel. And I was so intrigued by the last thing that you just said, Abby, so I guess I'm going to maybe start turning this into a discussion inadvertently, this idea of measuring, whether we don't know whether the long-term impacts are there. I think it brings to mind kind of the schism that we have been skating the whole time between talking about, on the one hand, women, and on the other hand, gender, where women is a sex-based determination, right? It's something immutable that's fixed, and universal, and gender is something culturally defined. And so when we're looking at the goals of these programs, are they to, and I agree, formal programs are to they tend to focus on quotas and look at the sex characteristics, and so in that way they could be a success immediately because they're involving this equal representation. But the question of whether they have impact on gender roles in the long term is another question that has yet to be determined because these programs are still so new and developing, and really this focus on women and conflict, which I was happy, Matt, that you brought into gender and conflict, comes from an omission, in a way, from international human rights treaties, from the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, had no explicit mention of conflict per se and combat, and instead it makes, I think, 3 references to peace generally, but as the women's movement sort of gained steam and moved along after CEDAW and moved to international conferences like the Beijing Platform for Action, there was this identification of the acuteness of women's needs in conflict and the ability, and really I think a strategic identification of there's an opportunity for more progress with gender equality here and a need for it in international interventions into conflicts. And that's part of what I have been interested in because I both worked at the grassroots level in East Timor on women's access to formal justice in post-conflict reconstruction, and then worked at the macro level at UN headquarters coordinating 11 NGOs, women's NGOs, on strategy to try to mainstream or influence the Security Council to mainstream gender through all of its resolutions. And that was what I thought I would focus on today, is the framework that's around Security Council Resolution 1325. And I wanted to ask first, how many of you have heard of Security Council Resolution 1325? A few of you.
They were all in my class.
Catherine too, right. So Security Council Resolution 1325 is it's notable that anybody knows about it, given that it is a non-coercive resolution, meaning it's not invoked under the Security Council's Chapter 7 power. It is a thematic resolution, a kind of broad resolution, and so it, for certain certain perspectives, it might be just totally negligible, right? It's soft law. It doesn't actually have any binding effect, but it addresses the needs of women in conflict. And so, when I looked at this, when I looked at the Security Council's adoption of Resolution 1325 in the year 2000, and it was a unanimous adoption, I kind of wondered, why is it that this bastion of state interest, you know, where state interest matters most, in security, which is this kind of, it's a frustrating realm for women's rights advocates to enter, because it seemed always beside the point. It was not related, women's rights were not related to security and conflict, was the sort of conventional wisdom. So how was it that the Security Council, with a number of skeptical and opposed permanent members, managed to adopt unanimously Resolution 1325? That was a question that I looked at in researching, and what I found was that the power of these women's rights groups, who had realized the gaps in the program that had been developing from the early women's rights movement, had basically decided to target the Security Council in advocacy around the same time that the Security Council had begun to relax its working methods and have more contact with NGOs and with civil society, when ARIA formulas were developed. And so they managed to persuade a number of members of the Security Council to adopt a focus on women, peace, and security. Resolution 1325 has ended up being a foundation for a framework that has developed, first entirely in voluntary national action plans by member states, and in internal administrative mechanisms within the UN, unevenly, falteringly, to encourage gender mainstreaming, which, when I say gender mainstreaming, what the idea is that every policy that the UN undertakes is questioned and examined for its effects on both men and women. And so this is part of what I think Catherine was referring to when she mentioned DDR programs having kind of a checklist now. Some of those have evolved out of Security Council Resolution 1325, and a kind of trickle-down effect from the Security Council telling DPKO and other organs of the UN to do this. And I actually brought some of those checklists with me if anyone's interested in seeing them after the session. But so gender mainstreaming is one focus. Another focus that's been mentioned by all of the speakers is increasing women's participation in decision-making, both at high levels of political leadership as well as in peace negotiations and at the local level pre-conflict, and in an attempt for conflict prevention as well as during conflict and after conflict. And a third major focus of Security Council Resolution 1325, gender mainstreaming, increasing political participation. And the third is an emphasis on harmonizing domestic level laws with international level laws that affect women. So incorporating sexual violence norms at the national level and ensuring that sexual violence violations are prosecuted. And it's on that last component that there's been the most progress in the subsequent 12 years since the adoption of Resolution 1325. Specifically, the resolutions that the Council has adopted have put in more binding and coercive mechanisms for enforcing sexual violence norms, including most recently in December, the Security Council listed 2 individuals from DRC on their sanctions, their 1533 committee on sanctions for sexual based violence offenses. So over the course of 12 years, there's been progress from a kind of non-binding, broad-based resolution to more specific resolutions that have concrete effects on individuals relating to women's rights, basically. And let's see, So the fourth focus, so there, I mentioned the three focuses. The fourth issue that's evolved out of the Security Council Resolution 1325 framework is Resolution 1960, which creates a framework for accountability within the UN system and is a formal mechanism for requiring reporting from all of the departments of the UN back to the Security Council via reports by the Secretary General. So basically coming out of this broad-based movement that sought to eliminate sex-based discrimination, to empower women, and to achieve equality between partners and treat men and women as mutual beneficiaries, because, I just want to put this out there, we've all alluded to this, but it's still the case that women earn 1/10 of the world's income, that women constitute 2/3 of the world's illiterates, and that, I mean, this is totally pertinent to your property example, women own less than 1/100th of the world's property. So those are kind of that was my answer to your question, Renee, about, you know, why should we care about women in conflict situations. These basic statistics and these inequalities are exacerbated by conflict, and they invite international intervention, and when that happens, to cast a blind eye to the effects of conflict, and that this intervention on gender would be a lost opportunity, basically.
Okay, thanks very much. Isaac and Azra introduced the issue of international law and how changes regarding gender and conflict have happened so quickly. Cora gave a possible explanation, the influence of non-governmental actors, but she also suggested that there can be these changes, these formal changes, UN Security Council resolutions at the top of the system, but much can remain unchanged at other levels. So that's certainly something that we want to keep our eye on and discuss. Before we go further, let's thank all our panels. But because there are so many interesting issues on the table, I have a suggestion for how we conduct the discussion, and it relies on this notion of the one finger and two finger question. Is that familiar to Syracuse communities? No. Okay. The way it works, and it's subject to abuse, I'll acknowledge that, but when it works well, it works very well. The idea is you have put up one finger if you want to change the topic. For example, if you want to focus on a different panelist and a different area of questioning. But if we have a discussion going and you want to chip in something brief, a follow-up question, something like that, perhaps to the same panelist who's been answering the question, just signal like that, and I'll call on you. And the abuse comes when people try to turn a two finger into a one finger, and I've had long experience recognizing the difference, and I'll let you know. I'll let you know if you abuse it. So that's what I propose. So the floor is open, and of course the very first questions are going to be one finger one. So and please, in the interest of time, pose your question to one particular panelist, and then if the others have something to add, they'll be invited to join in. Okay, so who would like to start? Yes, please.
For Professor Bertini also. I don't know if you have the same, but in Mexico, in the public service, we have a joke for women in the ministries, as ministers or as Attorney General. I worked for the first woman who was the first Attorney General in Mexico, and we joke that these high positions are against gender equality, because most of the teams of these women are full of men rather than women. I don't know if you had the same experience with your colleagues, or maybe this is only a Mexican pattern, Latin American pattern. But I lived that experience.
Yeah, well, as Matt started the conversation by saying the picture of President Obama with all those men around him, I mean, that's his day-to-day operation. Now, you know, that's not to say that that's all his policies, but those are most of the people that are around him in the White House during the day. I went out of my way to have a balanced staff. You know, in the UN you have to also balance nationalities too. So And then I set goals so that I said that any hiring manager, finally, the only way we got any movement on hiring more women, which started at 17% female professionals when I got there, and ended at 39%, but that's 10 years of work, was to finally, after several years of talking and seeing no action, my talking, but seeing no action other than hiring more men, was to put in performance appraisals. So people actually, managers were assessed, one of their points of their assessment was how well they did in hiring women. And their goal was 50% female and 40% developing country nationals. And unless you did, if you did that, you met your expectations. That didn't mean you did great. That means you met your expectations. That's the only thing that made a difference. So no, we tried real hard. Matt and I were just talking in the break about sitting around a table with more women at the table, and think about this from your own perspectives, except I hope often when you sit around the table, maybe not in the AG's office but other places, that you have a fair amount of women at the table. But in my lifetime, I've gone from, being the only woman in almost every room to being one of many, and there's a substantial difference in the character of the conversation when there's a critical mass of women. It doesn't have to be half, but it's got to be more than one or two, and then it's a different, more rich conversation, no matter what the topic.
Great.
This is for Professor Bertini as well. You had mentioned a few questions before about you came in and you were saying, I'm not an affirmative actionist. I mean, did you have sort of accusations or people kind of critiquing what you were doing because it's the quotas and whatnot, and how did you respond?
Yeah, no, I never said that. I said, I thought people thought that oh God, we have to have a woman now, and George H.W. Bush has given us this one, what does she know? And besides, she's only 42. That's kind of what I was pushing against. So, bottom line is what we did, and I say this as a lesson for the future, is not just, it didn't work for the Secretary General to say 50% of the staff should be women. Who cares? Nobody cares. What worked, as I told you, for us to really get women on staff was to put it in performance appraisal, make people accountable. But for ultimately what made sense for us, and then nobody pushed back, was that it was part of our mission. Because if our purpose was to end hunger, and people have been in my class, I've heard this already, but if our mission was to end hunger, then the way to end hunger on a household basis is to support the cook, who happens to be a woman. And so we have to get the food to women. So we have to get her the right kind of food at the right time. So we have to know what she needs, and then we have to talk to her, and then we have to put her in leadership. Can we talk to her? Then we have to have women on our staff so they can talk to her, because in many societies the men can't talk to the women. And then it all made sense. And you know what? Even the crusty old ambassadors didn't push back at that.
Yes, please.
So this is for Professor Steele, and I think a lot of you touched on this, but it struck in my head that you did. I'm very intrigued by the idea that the efficacy of putting more women on, especially negotiations to end conflicts, the efficacy is unproven. And I was wondering if you had suggestions for further reading or more to say about that, about what studies are going on, and I think it would be a hypothesis, but just what you might think is causing that. Is it that women aren't inherently more peaceful, or is there not a critical mass?
Yeah, so, well, I think there just aren't very good examples to study, right? And that's not really something we can experiment with. So the sort of Bertini-Cristia paper I mentioned before was an experiment where they randomly assigned the sort of distribution of gender at the local level in the local development councils in Afghanistan. We can't do a similar kind of approach. Not that you need to do an experiment, but we don't even have any observational examples to work with and compare in a real way, right? Like in the last peace talks, did the Colombian government include more women, and did the FARC include more women? No. So we don't know really what effect it would have. We can certainly hypothesize. I think it makes a lot of sense to think, both as Professor Evangelista mentioned at the outset, sort of women who reach that level of official sort of, especially on the government side, I think it's reasonable to assume that they've been successful because they speak a certain language, right? If Margaret Thatcher sits down at a negotiating table, we expect a different outcome than if, you know, the head of the World Food Program were going to join in, or the head of some NGO network, right? Who they are not invited, right? And so, I think it's an interesting question, and it would be interesting to think about the critical mass, even of socialized or women who are successful in these, I guess, in very institutional sort of bureaucracies, right? If that would make a difference anyway, as Professor Bertini suggests it would. I don't know in terms of whether that would change how the discussion was happened, or if they'd be more likely to reach an agreement, or if it would change the content of the agreement. I think there are lots of good questions about how it would change, and we don't, unfortunately, we just don't really know, right?
Anybody want to add anything?
But I certainly think it would be worth giving it a shot. Let's see what happens, because peace agreements are notoriously bad.
There is a lot of literature about the effect of women being involved in negotiation and women's different negotiating styles.
Yeah.
There's a lot of scholarship about that topic.
Yeah, but we don't have good examples of particular peace negotiations with the participation of women.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this. I think this is a much more complicated question than it appears at first, because it's not really about plugging in, but it's some kind of, so if you plug, and Israeli army is one good example, you know, plugging women in, if the structure doesn't change, right? Are women actually becoming more militarized and by extension masculinized in some ways, in ways they can express themselves, speak about problems, right? Language they have to use to do, types of things they have to prove to do in order to be accepted or recognized even as partners, right? Are actually adding women to forces, as we heard right before the break. Is this actually creating more equality and diversity, or is it actually militarizing society as a whole, thus actually even deepening certain kinds of structural oppressions while naturalizing them as well? They're more women, right? But still running the same course. So does just the presence of women do these kinds of things we expected to do, or are the scripts so embodied and naturalized that, you know, we come to this discussion already predetermined to? I'm just thinking with you. Am I thinking with you?
You are.
Good.
That actually makes a lot of sense to me. When you were originally talking, something that occurred to me is, you know, is this that we need to get more women on, or you know, are there men that have more, you know, peaceful tendencies or different negotiating styles, and they're not succeeding in the system because the system is the way it is? And so, is it that we need more women, or we need more people with, you know, different negotiating styles?
Well, you have feminists, right? Really hardcore, very extremely theoretical Lacanian tradition. Irigaray comes to mind. Anyone read Irigaray? Who thinks that we need signifying economy beyond this economy. We don't even have language in which we can speak as women. That we already, the grammar we used is mess. So she would recommend you cannot go through UN, right? Because it's already, but, you know, she's Irigaray. Many people say, well, where is that universe, right? So I'm just curious, how do we negotiate between these two things? On the one hand, you have to celebrate the fact that women are becoming more that there are more women at the table, that they're parts of the discussions, at the same time as recognizing these larger, historically rooted inequalities that are becoming naturalized, right? So I don't know if I could go as far as Irigaray, but
So,
maybe. I don't know.
So Abby, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to, something that Azra said just made me remember that in terms of plugging women in, right? Not in terms of the peace negotiations, but in terms of women as combatants. We may be achieving some dimension of equality there, and of course individual freedom for a woman to decide what she wants to do, but there's been a ton of victimization of women within the U.S. military by U.S. military. I mean, it is astounding, the prevalence of sexual violence in the U.S. military. And so, I mean, even I think greater than the victims of any kind of civilian victims that the U.S. military has had over the last decade. I mean, it's really, really troubling.
No, I heard on the radio this morning a figure of 19,000 cases over the last year. But if I may, Isaac, I wanted to respond to something that you actually mentioned earlier, that this paradox between the increasing attention to issues of sexual violence during warfare, including in international law, the Rome Statute, and so forth, coinciding with these notorious incidents of peacekeeping forces engaging in sexual exploitation, prostitution, slavery, that kind of thing. And I wonder if that might be an area that would be ripe for an experiment, if there were more female soldiers, a much higher proportion of female soldiers engaged in peacekeeping operations, if there were more women at various command levels, leadership levels in the United Nations supervising peacekeeping operations, would you see the same level of sexual exploitation, or would you see some kind of gender impact for the better there? And I wonder, those of you who have experience with that, what you think or what you've seen.
I'll just add, if you're interested, you may want to look at the writing of Dalia Golan. She's done some very interesting work on women in the Israeli military. Now, Israel, of course, has a national conscription, but one of her studies indicate is that women have to join the military in order to participate in whether it is the political or the economic sectors, because Israeli society places such a huge emphasis on military service. Sorry.
Would you mind just repeating her name?
Yes, it's Dalia Golan, G-O-L-A-N. She's a professor at the Interdisciplinary Center. Because of that militarization of Israeli society, if you don't serve in the military, there's going to be some questions about your ability maybe to be a political leader. So Tzipi Livni would be an example that people keep emphasizing her role in the Mossad or in the security services to highlight that. In terms of peacekeeping, I think the really good case study would be Liberia and the Indian women peacekeepers. I mean, you had a battalion of Indian women who did phenomenal work and been commanded by Helen Johnson and others. And they patrolled the streets of Monrovia without having to fire a single gun. Their ability was, because of their gender, they were able to promote peace and greater understanding in Liberia as a result of that. And you'll see similar things with Norwegian peacekeepers in Lebanon, operating with Shiite community, where women Norwegian peacekeepers were able to better interact with the local community and help bridge the divide, especially when it came to domestic violence, because the women were able to tell the Norwegian peacekeepers, look, this is what happened to me, and can you maybe at least get a doctor to come and see me without offending cultural barriers. So one of the other things that I think we need to address here is cultural issues, cultural barriers, because at the UN level, certainly we are very, sometimes, I would submit, I think we're sometimes too careful about offending cultural values. As far as I'm concerned, the enslavement of women is unacceptable in any society, and I will preach against it. Trading women as part of marriage, unacceptable. And when we give it a check, when we provide assistance in Afghanistan, I would say that's something that we need to maybe address at our level. So that's kind of my 2 cents.
Okay, did anyone want to jump in over here? Okay.
I would only add that Security Council Resolution 1325 and its gender mainstreaming has applied to DPKO, and these checklists that I brought are in part about staffing the peacekeeping forces, and it's been a real struggle for DPKO to include, to demand and require gender disaggregated data in country level reports, and it's sporadic, it happens not regularly, and that's been one major emphasis, is to just gather the data still in 12 years after Resolution 1325. How many female versus male peacekeepers do we have? This type of issue. It's something that's being worked on, but it's not. It's still way behind.
But even when it comes to sexual abuse that peacekeepers commit, the most that the UN can do is simply ask the member state to take back the soldier and hope that that person will be prosecuted at home.
That's true. That's true. Legally, that's all they can
Yeah.
do. But next time they could say, "We're not going to take any more of your peacekeepers until we know that you've done
Yeah.
X." They could do that if they want to.
But
It's
that-
not like
But that becomes difficult when it comes to these private contractors, and
Yes.
they are out of any
That's-
kind of
yes.
legal system, right? And they're
Yeah.
who are they responsible
But
to?
there's also, you may also want to look at sentencing practices within international tribunals. One of the things, sentences practices when it comes to rape. Statistically, there is some evidence to suggest that if you are going to have at least one or two female judges hearing a rape case, you are going to see a higher conviction and a higher sentencing. In a number of cases to do with rape as an international crime, it was women judges who really pushed the envelope on that discussion. So the case of Akiaso, the case of Nokolic in the ICTY, it was Judge Cristina Odoleno who really pushed the envelope on that one and demanded that the prosecutor adjust the indictment. And there was a lot of resentment.
Okay, so we are pretty much out of time, but if you're willing to indulge me, there was one issue that came up earlier that sparked some interest on both sides of the panel that it might be worth pursuing for a moment, and that's the great deal of variation in sexual violence in conflict. So we have the Bosnian case, notorious for the high prevalence. We have other examples like the FARC in Colombia where there wasn't as much. There are scholars who have done quite good work. Elizabeth Jean Wood at Yale is one of the most prominent, but Azra had mentioned that she has a hypothesis, and I wondered how if we could just have just a little dialogue here to kind of wind things up on this very depressing note.
Well, it's not mine. I'm stealing it. And there's a scholar. He's an anthropologist of the Balkans at Pittsburgh. His name is Robert Hayden, and he has this interesting hypothesis that says that if there is a blueprint, a script for that imagines coexisting life after the violent event, conflict, or some kind of transformation, rape will most probably not happen. However, if the idea is really to totally destroy the social fabric and to secede or to separate the people, then rape is more likely to take place because then there is no repair after that. That's the idea. So he doesn't look across societies necessarily, but he historically looks how in India, for example, at times rape was heavily used in some instances in events of community violence. And then there's some examples in Indian history when it wasn't. And he found that if the script was, we cannot live together, rape was utilized as a mass rape. If the script was, well, there is some kind of disagreement, but there is no idea that we will not emerge as one society, then rape was not utilized. So this is his idea, and you know, it's an interesting thing. It hasn't been tested, but he did look at the Balkans and India, because these are his two areas of expertise, and it's quite an interesting. It's an interesting idea to play with. So that's when I was hearing you, that's what I was thinking about, and maybe you already have an ideas that go against his idea, but it's an interesting thought.
Yeah. Maybe. Sorry. No, I think that sounds interesting as well. What that theory can't really help us understand, though, is how armed groups within the same conflict behave differently, which seems to be a fairly regular empirical pattern as well. So why, for example, in Sierra Leone, the RUF was particularly bad, right? But the other side, the name of which I'm failing right now. And some groups within even one single armed group can certainly behave differently, right? So Libby was one of my advisors, so I'm familiar through her with this variation where Elizabeth Wood has tried to figure out how to document and characterize this kind of variation by armed group within civil wars and across civil wars. And I think it's really interesting. I don't think she has a strong sort of answer yet, but she's certainly focusing on the institution of the armed group and the sort of disciplinary mechanisms within the armed group and how those armed groups treat violence in general.
That was the main impression I took from her work, that the focus on unit level discipline is especially important. It's not fully it's not necessarily inconsistent with this
Right.
view, because
No.
if the script actually turns into rules of engagement, so to speak,
Right.
and the unit is trained in order to engage in that
Right.
type of
You can have
violence,
multiple
then you
scripts.
could
You
could
can have
imagine.
multiple scripts, right? You can have one side with one script and another with another. So that would explain why one does and what doesn't on the same scale, right? Not to say that this group rapes and this doesn't. I think that's really simplifying it. But
And it would be the hope of international lawyers that law has some effect on this. I know there are anecdotal stories of Central African Republic and rebel leaders carrying the Rome Statute in their back pocket and then not committing sexual-based violence, and so but what determines
Yeah,
that?
no, a former student of mine worked in that area, and there was one local leader who was really taken with it and broadcast on the radio the basic rules. And no, I think it's not a totally utopian hope that law will have some impact. So.
I don't also know if this holds across cultures, but also there's some scholars that try to show it how in the societies in which intercommunal intimacy was more pronounced, such as mixed marriages were more present. Actually, sometimes you have tendency to have more of these rapes than less.
It takes more to break up a community.
Right. So this is the most. This is the link that actually severes it. Apparently, according to the script, completely. Also, because the female other is not seen as polluting; it's already being incorporated into something that's acceptable as it's something that can be deeply, intimately penetrated, if you want. I cannot find a better word at this point because but I'm using it at many levels here. However, depressed.
No, well, I think it's time for us, for me to thank Professor de Nevers for organizing the panel, for inviting me, and for putting together such great panelists. Thank you.